Hello everybody. I really love the Lexus LC500. I mean, like, real serious man crush on that car. If you haven't seen my recent review of it, I suggest you go and check that out. I'll put the link up here. Now, that car I described as something of a bargain. However, I'm not an unrealistic person, and I appreciate the fact that for many people, the £55,000, which is what it costs you to get the cheapest used LC500, is still quite a bit of cash. So if you fancy something a bit like the LC500, but you haven't quite got the budget, well, this is probably the car for you. This is a 2015 Lexus RC F, and you could pick one of these up now for around about £30,000. It's not quite the same as an LC500, but it does have some of the same ingredients that made that car quite so special. The 5-litre naturally aspirated engine, which puts out nearly the same amount of power. It's 470 horsepower in this application and about 390 pound-foot of torque, which is not masses when you compare it to some of its rivals, but is certainly adequate. It's also made by very much the same skilled and dedicated team of people that put together cars like the LC500. In fact, Lexus will proudly tell you that all of the Takumi master craftsmen who assemble this car will have had at least 25 years of experience before they're allowed near one of these flagship cars. That F brand is a bit of an odd one. It doesn't appear all that often, but when it does, they tend to be quite special cars. You see, this car's owner and I do agree that Lexus are a very strange company indeed. In fact, nearly all of their product lineup is very nice cars indeed, but that seem to be hobbled by very odd choices in terms of powertrain, usually some sort of combination of a hybrid engine with a CVT gearbox or something along those lines. And as a petrol head, that's just not something that I can get on board with. And then they go and do bonkers things like this and the LC500 and every now and again the LFA. The LFA very much is Lexus's McLaren F1 because it seems that whatever they do, the LFA is gonna be mentioned. And I think that's fine. They evidently managed to create a legend in that car, and so they will certainly play on that. They'll mention all the different ways in which this car's a little bit similar to the LFA, but I think it's fairly obvious that this is not an LFA. What this is, in theory, is an M4 rival, or perhaps an RS5 rival, or maybe a C63. The truth is, this is actually a very different car to all of them. For a start, this is the only one which is still available with a naturally aspirated engine. And what an engine it is. At low RPM there is, well, very little, but it does sing. It's also geared quite long, it turns out, which makes it very odd when they've got 8 of them that they decide to space them quite so far apart. The LC500 isn't much better, having 10 gears. This is a different gearbox to that, of course. It's still a traditional torque converter automatic. Not that that's what Lexus call it. They have a very fancy, complicated technical name for it, but it is an auto box. Now, this car's sole modification you may already be enjoying, which is the Quicksilver back box, and it frees up a glorious noise. The car steers very well. The weight of the wheel is just about right. It's not BMW heavy, but it certainly responds well. The gearbox actually is quite impressive. I had a suspicion that that might let the package down, but actually it doesn't. Now, when you sit into these utterly stunning seats, you are greeted with this very curious interior. And I say curious because it's this weird sort of mix of materials and finishes, and it does actually all work. It does certainly feel cohesive. There's definitely shades of the LC500 in here, with all the kind of angular surfaces that jut out and remind me of an old school supercar, something even like a Lambo Gallardo, Lotus Esprit. These have got the same sort of sticky outy dash, as the best technical term I can think of it, as this does. It's certainly not a small car, but it really does feel luxurious when you're in here. All of the interior stuff in here does feel like it's a sort of generation or two old, lots of buttons and things, but it also feels very high quality. This car's been owned for about 2 years, and in that time nothing of note has gone wrong, as you would expect with a Lexus product. The Japanese are incredibly proud of these cars, and rightly so. In many ways, this is actually a more successful styling exercise than the LC500. The 500's got quite a few questionable styling cues about it and does feel a touch overstyled. Not that I mind too much, but it is the sort of car that I'm not sure if you owned one whether it would get prettier or uglier as time went past. This is a touch more conservative, but not that much. My favourite piece is the front headlights. There's so many different surfaces and angles and things going on. It's really quite wonderful to look at, and far more complex when you get up close than you realise at a quick glance. Unfortunately, the interior in this car also has the funky trackpad that the LC500 does, so if you're not a fan of controlling your infotainment that way, I'm afraid this car is going to be equally as tricky. You can tell the fact that it is a generation earlier infotainment system, but you've got a nice Mark Levinson hi-fi in here, which I'm sure sounds pretty decent, and you've got a few pieces of carbon fibre as well. Now, the current version of the RC F is available in a few different trim levels. You've got the regular car, Plus Pack, the Carbon, and there's also a 10th anniversary edition. And the only options of note really are a sunroof and a torque vectoring differential. Now, this car was deliberately chosen without the torque vectoring differential because in place of that, it has a regular Torsum mechanical limited slip diff, and its behaviour apparently is considerably more predictable than the torque vectoring item, which can be a little wayward at times. Now, that glorious V8 up front does have one party piece, which is when you're driving gently and in eco mode, it can run in something called Atkinson cycle. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining what that is now, but it's a different way for the valves to work and is an attempt to eking a little bit more economy out of the engine. Now, Sean, the owner, tells me that on a trip to the airport, he once managed to get 38 miles to the gallon out of this car. And as a big V8 owner myself, that is incredibly impressive. The car certainly feels remarkably comfortable, actually. This has passive dampers. Newer models, I believe, are available with adaptive ones, but this was not. I'm now going to switch it into sport mode, which will change a few things, including the gear shift, possibly the throttle response, and see how she does. It's certainly not short on low RPM pickup, but if you own something like a current M3 or M4, you'd be rather unimpressed with it. What won't disappoint though is that noise. Downshift, very responsive. And it certainly shifts, but you do have to keep it in an unnaturally low gear. My head wants me to be in sort of third and fourth along this road, but the car actually would prefer me to be in second and third, which just feels a little bit odd. This is a very difficult and technical road with a far from perfect surface, and this has been the undoing of many a car. But considering this is a big old bus, it is quite impressive. And there's no getting around it. This is a very large and heavy car. In fact, it weighs pretty much the same as the LC does, so actually slightly less, so how they made the LC even heavier, I don't know. This is over 1,800 kilos, I think, if we're being honest about it, and with two of us in here, it's definitely over 2 tons. And the road surfaces, as you can probably see, are a little bit mixed today. You've got a little bit of damp, a little bit of dry, and it's a good day for testing a car's behaviour, and this car is very well behaved. absolutely no creaks, rattles or anything else in here apart from my camera, which is normal, and I am very impressed with it. You got pretty chunky tyres there, 19-inch wheels, you got 255 section up front, 275s at the back, and the car feels nice and planted. Direction change is pretty good. Steering doesn't have masses of feedback, but it weights up nicely, which actually is not something that a lot of modern cars do. So that is impressive. You can carry a reasonable speed through here, and it's not shaking you around. It does do what I expect it to. Is this better than an M3 or an M4? Well, I think if you're interested in an M3 or an M4, the answer is almost certainly going to be no, because those cars are going to be better at being sportier. This car, I think, is probably a more interesting alternative to perhaps the Audi, because the Audi is the one that, for me, has the best interior and all that jazz. The new Mercs don't really do that much for me, although they do have absolutely stonking engines, but you then wind up in this kind of discussion of, well, how much power and torque can one actually reasonably deploy on the road? And this car seems to be sitting in a nice happy medium where you can enjoy it and you can have fun, but you're not going to be going at obscene speeds. That is, unless you bring it out in a couple of the other gears. And that, to be honest, is perhaps my main criticism of the car. Gearbox is lovely to use, but the ratios are just a bit wrong. Otherwise, the car is actually really quite impressive when you consider the fact that it is, well, now a 5-year-old model and is a spin-off of the IS, which is even older, and it does have an old school engine, but it doesn't really feel like an outdated car. Feels a bit old school, but not outdated. And there is a very big difference between those two things. Overall, I really quite like this. Is it an LC500? No. Is it well worth 60% of the money of an LC500? Absolutely, and it is a little bit more practical too. You've got a much bigger boot, you've got slightly more usable back seats, although Lexus will be fairly honest and call this a 2+2 rather than a 4-seater, and it makes that wonderful noise. Gets a thumbs up from me, and it's a Lexus, and Lexus are cool when they want to be. Anyway, everyone, thank you all for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this little look at a beautiful Japanese super saloon. We'll see you all for the next one. Please do hit the like button, comment below, and subscribe if you haven't already, because it does make a big difference to me and the channel. Bye bye.